Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. First and foremost, happy birthday, Your Holiness Dalai Lama. On the 6th of July, the Dalai Lama turned 90 years of age. So this video today is to wish him a happy birthday by reading a chapter from one of my upcoming books about my various experiences with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan movement in general. I've been involved in international politics for a long time, since the 1980s. I remember very vividly the day that good news came on the news, repeatedly, many times. I remember it so clearly when they announced that the military dictatorship regime in Argentina was over in 1983 after those 7 horrible, dirty war years. I remember so clearly the day they announced that Nelson Mandela was walking free from prison after 27 years, something we never thought would happen. And then a few short years later, apartheid was ended once and for all, and multiracial, multi-party democracy could take place in South Africa. I remember very vividly again, also, much to our surprise, that East Timor would finally get independence after 24 brutal years of occupation by Indonesia. I remember again vividly. These are all places that I worked or had something to do with as well, so they're very close to me. I remember vividly the day that the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed, ending the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a place where I worked extensively afterwards and where I briefly lived. I remember very vividly the totally unexpected fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Something also we never thought would happen. Just happened. Out of the blue. There it fell. I rushed over there to Berlin, where I've been so many times. I have so many incredible experiences there. And I, of course, grabbed a few pieces of the wall as souvenirs of that incredibly symbolic day, which unleashed so many forces of good in the world, which we'll talk about in future episodes. I remember vividly, too, another movement with which I was involved, trying to get a peace agreement for the people of Bougainville, when they finally got to vote on their referendum of independence in 2019, something which 98% of the population or so voted in favor of. They still don't have it, but they're working towards it, and things are moving. Also, a remarkable development. I remember, again, vividly, when the first of the 2 Oslo peace accords were signed between the State of Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1993. Another issue that I've also been involved with, working extensively on the issue of refugee return, Palestinian refugee return, and Palestinian housing, land, and property rights, restitution rights, which still remain outstanding, as in unresolved, for the millions and millions of Palestinians that have been forcibly displaced from their homes since 1948. And there are countless other positive events that occurred seemingly out of the blue, seemingly without warning, which brought smiles to faces across the world. I'm still hoping for countless more as time rolls on. And I believe people of goodwill, who are the majority, people who are caring about fellow humans, who are in the majority, will also get to smile down the road. We can think of countless possibilities. One of those, of course, is concerning the question of Tibet. People of Tibet believe that they have rights to self-determination, as do hundreds of millions of people across the world. People of Tibet believe they have a right to some degree of at least political autonomy, if not independence. But the People's Republic of China and the government there does not see things in that manner. Maybe one day we can dream that suddenly it's announced on television, it's announced online, it's announced on social media, that they've had a change of heart and negotiations, meaningful negotiations, have commenced between the Tibetan government in exile, which is based in Dharamsala, India, fully allowed by the government of India, and the People's Republic of China, to find a way forward so that the wishes of the Tibetan people can be taken more seriously than they have been to date. Just imagine that. Just imagine if that was to occur. It could occur. So, on the 6th of July, the Dalai Lama turned 90. Last year, I wrote a book that gives a few accounts of my life as a human rights activist across the world, working in more than 80 countries. Subtitle of that is the joyous highs and the devastating lows of an eccentric human rights life. I'll leave the actual title as a mystery, but hopefully that'll be published in a couple of months after I do some more editing. Anyway, one of the sub-chapters is about occupation and a few experiences I've had with the Tibetan movement and with the Dalai Lama himself. So I'm just going to read a few snippets from that chapter in the hopes that you find it interesting. It's quite a story. Hope you'll stay listening. So here goes. It starts off with a quote from the Dalai Lama. Everybody wants a happy life, and our individual happy life depends on a happy humanity. So we have to think about humanity, discover a sense of oneness of all 7 billion human beings. He obviously wrote that when there were only 7 billion, not 8.2 billion like today. How could anybody disagree with those sentiments? Anyway, here goes. It's not often, but when I'm feeling down, hopeless about the state of the world, sad or lonely, I sometimes look at my hands and think of all the places those little fingers and thumbs have been. Grasping the delicate and gentle touch of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's soft hands often comes most poignantly to mind. It's been a while since I held the Dalai Lama's hands in mine, but I was lucky enough to spend a whole series of moments with him from 1990 to around 2002 or so, when I was particularly active in the Free Tibet movement, which I still very ardently support. As mentioned, I've had the good fortune of working with numerous national liberation movements and developing amazing and close friendships with their people and leaders, South Africans during apartheid, East Timorese during their fight against Indonesian occupation, Kurds, Palestinians, and many others, still in the midst of their struggles, including hundreds of Tibetans. Of course, I had read books by the Dalai Lama and heard rumors of his enlightened state and even magical powers, but it was meeting my girlfriend at the time, in the early 1990s, that brought me into the Tibetan scene. Luckily for me, this included many beautiful moments with the Dalai Lama himself, just him and me, hands in hands, peering deeply into each other's eyes, but more on that in a moment. My girlfriend at the time lived in the Tibetan capital, Lhasa, perfecting her Tibetan language skills from the masters themselves, and having amazing love affairs, including one with a wild braided Kampa horseman that I loved hearing about all those years later, when we were a couple, especially the time when he said to her in a romantic moment of pure lust, "Come, eat meat," as he pulled the lower leg of a smoked yak from his saddlebag. After becoming more and more a part of the social fabric of Lhasa, on what became what will almost assuredly be her last day ever in the main city of the occupied land, a molten bullet found its way into her arm, shoulder, and back. It seems to have gone straight through her, and she survived to tell the tale. She was casually watching an impromptu political demonstration on the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on 10th of December, 1988. After having lived 18 months in Tibet, working as a translator from Tibetan into English. For any foreigner living in Tibet, where there were only a handful of Westerners living at the time, and probably even less now, support for Tibetan independence, or the Tibetan people generally, was far from rare. As one of very few Westerners speaking fluent Tibetan, her role in pushing for Tibetan freedom was no small task. Yet, as she was well aware, any Tibetan who was seen talking to her risked severe punishment, if not worse, particularly at a demonstration. Any Tibetan courageous enough to resist Chinese rule would have to do so in complete secrecy, which is difficult with handsomely paid spies everywhere. With the extreme surveillance across the territory China controls now, it would be even riskier. Possession of the Tibetan flag, if caught, is punished harshly and can end in the premature entrance into one's next incarnation. Yelling Pu Rongzhen, or Free Tibet, can lead to the same fate. Just about anything we take for granted can form the basis for the most brutal treatment imaginable. A close and trusted friend asks her on that fateful day, "Hey, did you hear there might be a demonstration tomorrow?" The next morning, 10 December dawns, with skies blue and freezing cold, yet tension dripping from the heavens. A few people begin crowding around the Jokong Temple, one of the sources of Tibetan Buddhism, and shouts are beginning to be heard. "There's my girlfriend standing on the edges of an ever-growing early morning illegal demonstration, while I was 10,000 kilometers away running around in Vancouver, giving a keynote lecture on housing rights to a nationwide conference, when all hell breaks loose in Lhasa. Thank goodness there are some foreigners there, for at least they can get the news out to the rest of the world. They hope. Cameras click and forever capture the events of tragic horror. However, what happened next had not only never happened before, as far as anybody knew, but was totally unanticipated, completely unexpected, unpredictable. With a warning of about 2 seconds, a brigade of previously silent and unseen soldiers and police runs around the bend into the crowd where she is standing, and then they start letting their AK-47s and other weapons explode, firing straight into the crowd. She first thought it was firecrackers going off, just to scare the people away. But it was far from innocent fireworks. Without warning, from a distance of about 6 meters, they calculated later, a young Chinese soldier pulled the trigger. Now, some 37 years later or so, that soldier, probably around the age of 56 or 58, might be sitting in some apartment in Beijing, maybe living off a small military pension, looking forward to a burger or a pizza or some noodles for lunch, managing his online stock portfolio, shopping online from Alibaba, contributing to China's CO2 emissions, highest in the world, breathing some of the world's dirtiest air, and never really thinking about what he did in 1988. I often wonder who he was. I often wonder if he feels any remorse. I often wonder if he ever thinks of that day. I wonder this about soldiers everywhere when they do such things. All of a sudden, the burning metal of the bullet released from the barrel of his gun, feeling the cold mountain air, the molten hardens a bit, hits the edges of a parka borrowed from some American mountain climber, and pushes its way into her left arm, through the shoulder and out her back, although she only learned many hours later that it had actually gone through her, thank goodness. She hits the ground hard, but remains conscious just enough to realize that if she doesn't run, she's a goner. She stumbles up, turns her back to the rushing onslaught of soldiers, says internally, "Legs, do your thing." And they did, as another hail of bullets whizzed past her ears in increasing quantities. Another miracle she wasn't hit by more than one. She eventually collapses and is taken to a rudimentary local hospital. The doctors and nurses, without having given her any anesthetic, put their ungloved fingers straight into both ends of the bullet wound, causing her to pass out again. In the end, to make a much longer and fascinating story short, she survived, got out of Tibet a week later, went to Hong Kong, got some surgery, and then embarked on an intense lifelong spree of global campaigning for a free Tibet, which continues to this day. The very first time I was in the same room with the Dalai Lama was in 1990 at an event in Amsterdam that my girlfriend and others from the Tibet support group had organized, right before my kidneys broke down and put me into the hospital for a solid 19 days. Now, in case you're wondering, I'm not one of those Dalai Lama is God people, of which there are more than a few. But there is no doubting that this Nobel Peace Prize winning, compassionate and kind man belongs to a very special human category. Something incredible happens when he's around. The energy of the space changes, it softens, it becomes more vivid, more vibrant, special. There's something difficult to describe going on, which is so positive, and it's certainly at least partially because of this that I believe China is so fearful of this gentle, calm, and loving saffron-robed monk. I have seen this manifest many times, but beyond my own personal moments, which I'll outline shortly, let me tell you about one middle-aged Western gentleman, a professor, university professor, who was almost aggressively non-religious, non-spiritual, non-esoteric anything, totally down to earth, totally intellectual, Coke bottle, thick glasses, very academic, carrying books around wherever he went. He was this hardcore academic type, human rights activist, and as cool as can be, but mystically inclined, crystal energy believing, or cosmic consciousness embracing, he most certainly was not. He was the exact opposite. He was a battle-hardened human rightser who would find showing soft emotions in public as desirable as a visit to a Middle Ages torture rack. I watched him as he visibly melted into some sort of bliss nodules of glee right before my very eyes after he embraced with the Dalai Lama. I wish I could accurately describe in words what happened, for it was a marvelous thing to see. I'll never forget it. A few years later, during the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, I approached one of the Dalai Lama's Tibetan assistants, a close friend. I asked him to guide His Holiness towards another friend, Charles, who was working on health rights issues, so the two could meet. Naturally, I hoped for a repeat of that moment with the other man I just mentioned, the academic. Charles was the nicest guy, totally dedicated to human rights, but like the other guy I described, apparently with not a spiritual bone in his body, at least none that I knew of. I thought it would be great if the two could meet. So Na Wang, my friend, guides His Holiness over to Charles, seemingly picking him out of a rapidly growing crowd. The Dalai Lama takes Charles' hands, looks deeply into his eyes, and briefly embraces him. I watched as an initially reluctant, very tall Charles transformed before my very eyes, his biggest smile morphing into a sense of calm, the likes of which I had never seen in him. It washed over him as he slowly, blissfully, I can't think of a better word, and hesitantly walked away to ponder what had just happened to a man who thought he'd seen it all. Apparently he hadn't. I looked all over for him the next day amongst the thousands of participants attending this major global gathering, and finally I found him and asked about his moments with the Dalai Lama. In a manner totally not like him, he teared up and was almost dumbfounded, trying to explain in a coherent way something difficult to clarify in language alone. And he just said, "It's unimaginable what I felt at that moment. I'm 67 years old, and I've been all around the world a million times, and nothing has ever come close to whatever it was that I experienced in that moment. I guess it was true joy or something like that." I sat there smiling very happily, So glad to have facilitated that. And to this day, he had no idea that it was me that guided the Dalai Lama his way. China describes anyone who supports self-determination for Tibet or who otherwise backs the Dalai Lama as either a member of the so-called Dalai clique or as a splittist, someone intent on splitting the motherland, as they put it. They do not like it when there is any effort to repair the vestiges of history involving political control over territories it now claims, including Tibet, Xinjiang, or East Turkestan, as it is sometimes referred to, Inner Mongolia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or even the South China Sea, despite unfavorable international legal decisions against it. While China has achieved a great deal since Deng Xiaoping famously said something to the effect of "to be rich is glorious" in the 1980s, it has come at a considerable cost. And its stand on Tibet seems to have become only more intransigent. They have raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's one of the most extraordinary achievements ever by any government in the history of humanity, just during the last 20 or 30, 40 years. They will soon be the world's largest economy. China has achieved immense things, has made progress in areas that no one could have ever predicted. And we are hopeful that its views on Tibet can soften in the coming years as the wealth and abundance of that society increases. Tibet, of course, has proposed, or at least the Tibetan government in exile has proposed, not outright independence, but they've taken a much softer approach, which is to have some degree of meaningful autonomy and turn Tibet into a zone of peace, essentially acting as a buffer state, really, between China and India, who continue to have rather unpleasant feelings towards one another, shall we say. For those of you who know your history, of course, the Chinese Communist Party came into power in 1949 with the successful revolution led by Mao Zedong, and took over Tibet at the same time. Tibet retained a degree of autonomy for about 10 years, at which point in 1959, the Dalai Lama felt it necessary to flee to save his life. Since that time, China has implanted millions of Han Chinese settlers into Tibet in its own version of settler colonialism, in a mass act of population transfer to gain political, economic, and social control over the territory where there were previously very few Chinese people living. Sound familiar? With each passing day, Tibet's chances of renewed independence seem ever more distant, despite the incredible efforts of the Tibetan government, headed until recently by my old friend Lobsang Sangye, who has been widely praised for his efforts. Although he had what must be one of the world's hardest jobs, Lobsang is lucky in one way, in that he gets to be with the Dalai Lama all the time. I've only had that chance a few times, but of the millions of moments of a pretty eventful life, these moments with the Dalai Lama are definitely some of the most precious I remember. Besides arranging that little moment of bliss between the Dalai Lama and Charles, as I just mentioned, I had a whole bunch of similar moments during those amazing summer days in Vienna at the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights. One time we were lined up waiting for the Dalai Lama to come into a room. I was standing next to my pal, Jose Ramos Horta, the current president of Timor-Leste. And this is during the time that Timor-Leste was still occupied by Indonesia, and he was fighting for the independence of his people, which he did tirelessly for 25 years. He knew the Dalai Lama as well. As the Dalai Lama and his crew passed by, the crowd grew unruly and too large. My friend Nawang, one of the assistants to the Dalai Lama, grabbed me quickly, instantly turning me and Jose into the Dalai Lama's bodyguards. We surrounded him for the next 15 minutes, keeping him safe until he reached the room for his next speech. Nawang and the other Tibetans gave me the Tibetan nickname of Tashi Trungdo, which he told me meant something like bright, sparkly one, so I'll take that name any day. Another time, Dalai Lama was giving a talk outside the official venue in Vienna at a public park nearby. All of us went there, and I stood back while a bunch of people tried to get their moment with him. After he finally hopped back in his car in the right-hand passenger's back seat, window down, I went up alone to the car, smiled, and he reached his hands out. We held hands for a few moments, me yelling, "Pu Rongzen, Pu Rongzen." I couldn't think of anything else to say. "Free Tibet, free Tibet." To which he replied, "Rongzen, Rongzen. Yes, yes, Tashi Trungdo." I was so happy at that moment in time. A year or two later, at another event in Holland that was hosting him, the organizers put me in charge of the green room where the Dalai Lama would wait before going on stage, to act both as security and, well, just to keep him company. He only came along briefly, but it was another one of those moments that you remember forever. My immersion into the Tibet movement continued to grow, and for 2 full years, a luxury of time I haven't had since then, I spent every day writing, rewriting, and editing and re-editing my own little unique contribution to the Tibetan cause. The 200-page book called Destruction by Design, Housing Rights Violations in Tibet, published in 1994. That was my second book. There's 28 now. I hadn't looked back at this book for some time until recently, but when I did, I found that it was actually much better than I remembered, and has somehow remarkably withstood the test of time. On the negative side, however, I discovered exactly what I hoped I never would discover. And that is that real-life events revealed that every single one of my many predictions about future human rights violations concerning housing and land and property came true. And sadly, China implemented all of the moves and maneuvers that seemed imminent at the time of the publication more than 30 years ago, much to the Tibetans' detriment. Niels Bohr, the famous physicist, famously said something like, "Predictions are difficult to make, particularly about the future." Well, sadly, I bucked the trend on that one. Alas, something I wish wasn't so. We printed and distributed thousands of copies of the thick and beautifully designed book to every government at the UN in Geneva, sending them by post all around the world to other strategic recipients, and then brought a whole car full of them, of boxes of those books, hundreds of copies, to a big international Tibet meeting held in rural Norway in 1994. We drove from Holland through Germany, then Denmark, to the northern tip of the country, then on an overnight ferry that was extremely rough, finally landing in wonderful Norway. The very prim and proper border guards, dressed immaculately and behaving in the most law-abiding manner possible, asked these clearly alternative-looking people in the car, me and my girlfriend, which with Dutch number plates, why we were visiting Norway. They were suspicious. The Dutch plates likely signaled a pro-drug country traveling to a very anti-drug country, like many of the Nordic states. The car was chock full of more than 80 boxes of undeclared goods. We simply told them about the meeting we'd be attending and that we'd filled the boxes with non-commercial items. They said, "Okay, we have some dogs who wish to smell your car." Again, I had one of those moments of dread, my mind racing if I'd forgotten to stash a roach or a bud in my luggage, and the dogs went a bit crazy, leading us to have to open a couple of the boxes, but no contraband other than Tibet-supporting literature was found in our aging, borrowed BMW. We distributed over 1,000 books at that meeting of Tibetan support groups from all across Europe. In subsequent years, seeing the book populating countless NGO bookshelves and noticing the actions Tibetans and their supporters took on housing, land, and property issues made the whole project worth it, even if China didn't seem to care that much. Oh, I have a copy of it here. Forgot. There it is. Destruction by Design. Have a look. Anyways, a few years passed, and I continued my support for the Tibetans, always doing whatever I could in Geneva to help them out at the UN. But it had now been a few years since being in the same space as the Dalai Lama. So when I heard that he was coming to Switzerland again, I immediately called Nawang, who was now the head of the Tibet office in Geneva, and I asked him to get me some tickets, which he promptly did. The Dalai Lama was to come to an event hosted by an organization called Moral Rearmament, which was formed in the immediate aftermath of World War II. It offers an incredibly beautiful venue in the foothills of the Alps in Caux, Switzerland, accessible by a cogwheel train up a steep track. Once you arrive, the view of the vista across the rest of the Alps and Lake Geneva below is well worth the trip. But views were the last thing on my mind. I wanted some serious good vibing with the Dalai Lama. As many times as I was able to share close proximity with him, I had a lingering feeling that I never really took full enough advantage of those embracing moments, and was committed to the whole hog on this occasion. This time I would make sure to stand eye to eye with the bodhisattva of our times, hand in hand, and peer as deep as I could into the well springs of enlightenment and see what I could find there. How would I make the most of this event, I wondered. I had 2 tickets, but my partner couldn't make it, so I had to take someone else. Who better to take than the most fervent pro-China supporter I knew in Geneva, a great American guy called David, who worked for the coolest, albeit probably least well-known UN agency called the UN Research Institute on Social Development, UNRISD. I loved going to meet with my friends at UNRISD because they were always so progressive, so internationalist, so oneness in orientation, just the types of people one would think would dominate UN staffing numbers. For all its flaws and foibles, the UN is the best there is at the moment. It is it. If a movement or a cause is seeking either vindication, justice, or even independence, the UN will be involved for sure, as it should. And my incredible good fortune to have assisted oppressed and occupied people, even in a tiny way, has always been at the top of my list of career highlights. I have conversed with so many oppressed people struggling for freedom, discussing what they would do on Independence Day when their country was finally free. Imagine that. The hateful occupiers having departed and the rightful owners back in charge. I recall strolling through Geneva with Ramos Horta well before East Timor got its independence, many, many years before. He pretty much ended up doing what he said he would, if and when he became free. But I'm sure getting shot and surviving, as did actually happen, was not on his agenda. I discussed the dream of a post-apartheid South Africa with a woman who I so easily could have married had she not had a few complications at home. She moved me to tears telling me of the first time she publicly raised her fist in support of the ANC and freedom, singing also for the first time the song which became the national anthem of the Rainbow Nation, Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika. She told me what she did both on the day Mandela was freed from his 27 years in prison and on the day of South Africa's first non-racial free election. I have similarly rapped with Palestinians and Kosovars and Kurds and Syrians and Bougainvilleans and Tibetans, one of whom says he'll be standing on a hill near the Dalai Lama's palace, the Potala, in Lhasa, cheering with hundreds of millions, maybe billions around the world that Tibet is at last finally free. There's no doubt that the wisdom of Tibetan Buddhism and all that it entails is quite literally millions of times more well known now throughout the world than it would have been had the Dalai Lama been stuck in the Potala his entire life. So at least there's one positive thing that happened as a result of the history of that place. In fact, I'm quite confident that were a global vote to be taken today between the people of Tibet on one side and the people of China on the other, the victor would probably be Tibet. I asked David to join me to come to the mountains and see what the Tibetans believe is the reincarnation of all previous 13 Dalai Lamas, figuring that after the amazing Charles Dalai Lama rendezvous, I should at least try to get David to reevaluate his stances on China. He agreed to come, so I immediately called Nawang and asked him to please make sure we could all meet up well before the Dalai Lama came into the room. so I could have a minute or two with him before he went on stage to achieve my two aims. First, turn David on to the Tibet scene and perhaps get him to question China's hegemonic aims. And two, peer deeper than ever before into the Dalai Lama's eyes and see what happens when I do. A day before this event was to take place, David calls me and says he couldn't make it, but that his 19-year-old sister, who had just arrived from South Carolina, could come in his place. My mind raced, and then I said, okay, just don't tell her what the event is. Just say it's an event, and I will accompany her there and look after her on this adventure. He says, okay, and then I meet up with Tori at the train station in Geneva early the next day. We hop on the train and head towards Montreux, where we'd get on the cogwheel train. Montreux, of course, is the town that hosts the famous annual jazz festival, and where everyone's favorite band, not really, Deep Purple, famously penned their iconic metal opus Smoke on the Water after looking down at the fog layer covering Lac Léman, or Lake Geneva. Did you know that? It's true. We went to the jazz festival a few times, and while it had that stiff, somewhat sterile Switzerland vibe to it, particularly compared to festivals elsewhere, which were anything but stiff, it was always fun. It was weird being the only person dancing of the thousands watching Laurie Anderson first and then a whole set by Lou Reed that I didn't care. I boogied even alone. Even odder, though, was seeing Rat Dog play there, Bob Weir's band, following the end of the formal Grateful Dead after Jerry Garcia's untimely death in 1995, for what must have been the smallest number of fans for a show by Bobby or Rat Dog ever. The event started with the great Buddy Guy, guitar virtuoso, who played an amazing set. Guitar rocker Chris Rea followed, who was also good. After both acts had played all that they would play, the massive room where the concert took place, which I estimate held over 3,000 people, cleared out almost entirely, leaving fewer than 100 of us deadheads for the Rat Dog show. Despite being billed as the top act, the organizers overlooked the fact that the Swiss hadn't yet embraced the deadhead culture. This was both sad for the poor Swissies, who largely went through life without the Dead experience, but at the same time utterly awesome, as just a few dozen of us hardcore Deadheads, most of whom were Americans, got to rock out to a virtually private show for a night to remember. We got to Montreux, and I asked Tori if she knew yet where we were going. She still had no idea. Even as we boarded the cogwheel train with obvious Buddhists and Tibet supporters, to the eyes of a young woman who had never left South Carolina, let alone the United States, now in Switzerland the day after, heading up a mountain to an event she knew nothing about, she still didn't get it. Even when we arrived at the venue and I asked again, she still didn't really know. I finally found Nawang, and we walked to the perfect spot, near the door where the Dalai Lama would enter and where he would guide him to Tori and me. I'm standing there as the crowd begins filing into a beautiful, quite intimate room, nervous in anticipation both for what I was about to do and for Tori, whose life would be turned on its head. The Dalai Lama entered the room, and Nawang brings him straight to me. He takes my hands as I barely hear Nawang remind the Dalai Lama that I was Tashi Trungdo, the author of Destruction by Design. When he heard that, yet another sparkle shoots from his eyes, having written me the nicest letter of thanks for my book some years earlier, and which still hangs on my wall today. I then make my move, those soft and gentle hands grasping mine, and I go for it. I gazed as deeply and intensively as I possibly could, right into both of the Dalai Lama's eyes, our faces just inches apart. I saw that he saw exactly what I was doing, and then he goes for it, totally. He noticeably moves into Bodhisattva overdrive. And that's when the merger begins. To the extent that I can even formulate concepts now, for I am now in a place I had never before been, his eyes literally become pools of glittering nectar, rippling and liquefying right there. My own eyes now unable to control the countless streams of tears flowing down my face. And then he goes deeper again, And I climb into those pools, bathing myself in all of humanity, all of life now, life that ever was, life that could ever be, immersed in the healing elixir of whatever it was that was. We had a mutual mind merge where oneness became fully tangible, fully real. It was as if not just our bodies in the form of our eyes and hands had merged, but our souls, our spirits, everything that is always already there, but which we almost universally fail to recognize or see or even try to. It was there at that moment, and it remains there to this day, and indeed has always been there as long as there has been life, and will be there for all of us to look forward to who have yet to see it, as long as there is life. This was pure and eternal, selfless, compassionate, oneness-infused love, free of any hate, free of any distinction or division, free of any delusions, just pure truth, eye to eye, one Saturday afternoon, gazing into His Holiness the Dalai Lama's eyes on a Swiss mountaintop, suddenly aware of the Bodhisattva before me. Just imagine what our planet could be like if more people were like this. We finally let go of each other, for he had to move towards the stage, and I stood there quite literally shaking, almost unable to stand, at which point I looked over to Tori, who was standing there in total and utter awe, also unable to move, just overwhelmed by what she saw, and then she said to me in a whisper, "Oh my God, was that the Dalai Lama?" "It sure was, Tori," I whispered back as I wiped my tears away. "Happy birthday, Your Holiness. May it be the best year yet. May you live many, 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 many more happy and healthy years. Peace to one and all.